She had studied for months, aced every practice test, rehearsed every answer. Yet when Maya Johnson, the only black student in the room, stood up for her final college interview, the professor smirked and said, "You must be lost. The service jobs interview is down the hall." The room froze. Every other student laughed nervously, waiting to see if Maya would sit back down or fight for the future already being stolen from her. But in the next 30 seconds, Maya was about to do something that would silence everyone. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The vaulted ceiling of the Whitmore Conservatory Music Hall stretched above the students like a crown of power. Gold trim lined the balconies. Polished wood reflected the soft glow of chandeliers. And at the center of it all stood the raised platform where only the most gifted musicians earned the right to perform. It was the kind of room built to intimidate, a shrine to tradition, and tradition here was not designed for everyone. Seated near the back, almost swallowed by the rows of polished chairs, sat Darius Coleman, 17 years old, his back stiff and his violin case gripped like it was a lifeline. His scholarship into this prestigious program had been the talk of his neighborhood in Detroit, a miracle snatched from chaos. But here, in the hallowed silence of the conservatory, that miracle felt fragile. Every side glance, every smirk from his classmates reminded him he was the one who didn't belong. The class buzzed as Dr. Richard Calloway strode to the front. His suit was tailored, his voice sharp, and his reputation notorious. Students whispered his name like a brand. He was both feared and admired. He had the power to make or break a career before it began. Calloway thrived on that power, scanning his students with a kind of cold amusement, measuring who was worth molding and who was worth discarding. Darius kept his gaze low, hoping to remain unnoticed. But Calloway's eyes found him. "Mr. Coleman," the professor said, his voice slicing through the chatter, "why don't you stand?" Darius's chest tightened. Slowly, he rose, violin in hand. A few students snickered, the kind of laughter that pretends to be harmless but isn't. "You're the scholarship student, yes?" Calloway asked, though everyone already knew. "Yes, sir," Darius answered, his tone careful, polite. The professor's smile was thin, calculated. "Ah, the prodigy from Detroit. Tell me, Mr. Coleman, what is it about the violin that called to you? Was it the elegance, the discipline, or was it simply the only thing small enough to carry around the block?" The room erupted in laughter. Darius's ears burned. He forced his jaw to remain still, though every muscle begged him to walk out. Calloway raised a hand, silencing the laughter just enough to lean into cruelty. No, I think I have a better idea. The violin, though charming, feels limited. Why don't we expand your horizons?" He gestured toward the corner where a cello rested against its stand, polished and untouched. "Pick it up." Darius froze. His heart raced in disbelief. "Sir, I've only trained in violin," he said carefully. "Exactly." Calloway's grin widened. "Consider this an exercise. Let's see if talent truly translates, or if limits are limits." Gasps whispered through the room. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't instruction. It was humiliation. Reluctantly, Darius set his violin down and walked to the cello. His hands trembled as he lifted it. Awkward, heavy, nothing like the familiar curve of his violin. The wooden body pressed against his chest, the bow strange and foreign in his grip. His classmates chuckled, whispering loud enough for him to hear. "Looks too big for him. He's gonna crack under it." Detroit kid with a cello, now that's comedy. Calloway circled him like a predator. "Now, sit. Place it between your knees." "That's right. Already uncomfortable, isn't it? But perhaps discomfort will teach you something. If not about music, then about humility." Darius's throat tightened. He wanted to protest, to shout that this wasn't fair, that no one else was ever asked to abandon their instrument on a whim. But he could see in Calloway's eyes that protest was exactly what the man wanted. A confirmation of weakness. So Darius sat, silent, swallowing every ounce of anger that threatened to spill out. "Now," Calloway said, tapping his baton against his palm. "Play." Darius blinked. "Sir, I don't play," Calloway repeated, louder. The class leaned forward, eager for the collapse. Darius lowered the bow to the strings. His grip was wrong, his posture stiff, and he had no sheet music to guide him. Still, he dragged a bow across the string, releasing a sound that screeched like metal grinding. The room erupted again in laughter. Calloway raised a brow, pretending to be intrigued. Ah, yes. The sound of raw potential. Or is it raw chaos? One never knows. Darius's cheeks burned hotter. He adjusted the bow, tried again, producing another harsh cry from the cello. The laughter grew crueler, echoing through the chamber that had once inspired him. In the balcony above, a pair of visiting donors exchanged amused glances, as though this were part of the entertainment. But beneath the humiliation, something unexpected stirred in Darius's chest. He had spent his entire life fighting to be heard through police sirens outside his window, through teachers who assumed his failures before they saw his work, through neighbors who told him dreams didn't belong on his street. This was not new. This was only another stage, and he would not give them the satisfaction of breaking. He closed his eyes, tightened his grip, and dragged the bow again. The sound wavered, still raw, still imperfect, but carried a strange depth, a vibration that filled the hall differently. For a flicker of a moment, the laughter dimmed. Calloway frowned. Darius adjusted again, leaning into instinct. The bow pulled across another string, producing a lower, richer note that seemed to hum through the wooden floorboards. His classmates shifted uneasily, their smirks faltering. It wasn't mastery, it wasn't even proper technique, but the sound was unexpected, haunting, alive. Something inside Darius connected to the cello in a way no one, not even he, anticipated. The professor's baton paused mid-air. His face tightened, as though the joke had just turned against him. The students sat still, unsure whether to laugh again or to listen. And then, just as Darius began to move the bow for a third time, the door to the hall creaked open. Heads turned as a figure stepped inside, drawn by the strange, imperfect, resonant note that had cut through the room. The laughter stopped entirely. As Darius gripped the cello for the first time, the hall froze at a sound that no one, least of all Dr. Calloway, had expected. The sound lingered in the hall long after it should have faded. But before anyone could react, before the professor could reassert his grip on the moment, the story folded backward into the silence where Darius Coleman's journey had truly begun. The silence of his childhood wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, broken only by the hum of traffic outside cracked windows, the distant shout of arguments in the street, and the unpredictable pop of gunfire that sometimes rolled through the neighborhood like thunder. Silence, in Darius's home, was survival. Speaking too loudly could invite attention you didn't want. Raising your head too high could make you a target. Inside a two-bedroom apartment on Detroit's east side, silence also belonged to Monica Coleman, Darius's mother. She carried exhaustion like armor, working double shifts as a nurse's aide, leaving at dawn, returning long past midnight. Her silence was not emptiness but sacrifice. Every unspoken word carrying the weight of bills, rent notices, and the quiet prayer that her son would not become another statistic. From an early age, Darius understood silence as both shield and wound. He learned to listen before speaking, to measure every response carefully, and to absorb what the world threw at him, without complaint. But inside that silence, something else grew, an ache, a search, and one evening, when he was barely 7 years old, that searching found its answer. It was the violin. Not his own. At first, a neighbor across the hall had a daughter who played for the school orchestra. Darius heard her practicing through the thin walls, awkward scales, halting attempts at simple songs. But for him, it was as if someone had cracked open a window in a suffocating room. He pressed his ear against the wall, imagining a world where sound could be beauty, not chaos. That Christmas, despite the pile of unpaid bills, Monica surprised him with a second-hand violin. The instrument was scratched, the bow frayed, but to Darius, it was treasure. He cradled it like it was alive. From then on, his nights transformed. When the city outside roared with noise, he countered with notes. His bow became his rebellion. His strings became his shield. "Keep it low," Monica would whisper, coming home bone-tired but still pausing at his door. "But don't stop. Don't ever stop, baby." For hours he practiced alone, fingers blistering, arms aching, teaching himself before any teacher would. The silence of his home was filled with the imperfect but determined sounds of a boy demanding more from life. By middle school, his gift had caught the attention of teachers. His tone wasn't refined, his technique was clumsy, but his ear was sharp. He could hear mistakes and correct them instinctively. Yet even as doors cracked open, voices rushed to slam them shut. "He's good," one instructor whispered once. "But kids like him never last in classical." Scholarship programs want diversity, but they don't expect real competition, another muttered, assuming Darius couldn't hear. At auditions, Darius noticed the looks, the raised brows when his name was called, the smirks when he walked on stage. He was too tall, too dark, too out of place in a field built on whiteness and privilege. Parents of other students whispered in hallways, as if his presence was intrusion rather than talent. Still, he played. Still, he returned to his apartment at night, setting his violin against his shoulder like a weapon against despair. By 14, the violin was no longer just escape. It was identity, but identity brought new dangers. His peers in the neighborhood didn't understand. Carrying a violin case through cracked sidewalks drew laughter, sometimes threats. "You think you're better than us?" Someone would sneer. "No, man," Darius would answer quietly. I just play." But playing made him different, and different could be dangerous. Monica began driving him to rehearsals whenever she could, even if it meant less sleep before her shifts. "If this keeps you safe, keeps you dreaming, it's worth it," she said. Her voice always carried both love and fear. Then came the audition that would change everything. Whitmore Conservatory had announced a national scholarship competition for gifted youth. Hundreds would apply. Only one or two would earn a full ride. The odds were impossible, but Darius's teacher pushed him. Monica prayed silently, and Darius, carrying both their hopes, stepped into a polished audition hall miles away from the cracked sidewalks of Detroit. The judges barely looked at him when he walked in. One adjusted her glasses as if to confirm what she was seeing. A black boy with a violin. Another tapped his pen impatiently. Darius's throat dried. He lifted his bow, and for a moment, the silence threatened to crush him again. Then he remembered his mother's words. "Don't ever stop, baby." He played. Not perfectly. His bow slipped once, his finger pressed too hard, but with something deeper than perfection. He poured into the notes every night of practicing while sirens wailed. Every insult he swallowed in classrooms. Every time someone told him he didn't belong. The music rose, raw and aching, impossible to ignore. When he finished, there was no applause, only a curt thank you. He left the room feeling hollow, sure he had failed. Weeks passed in silence. Then one evening, Monica burst into his room holding a letter, her hands trembling. "You did it, Darius," she whispered, tears catching in her tired eyes. "You got it, full scholarship. Whitmore Conservatory wants you." He stared, disbelieving. He had broken through. He had proved them wrong. He had escaped the silence. But what he couldn't know then, what the letter didn't reveal, was that silence takes many forms. In Whitmore's golden halls, silence would not come from neglect or poverty, but from something sharper, colder. The silence of being erased while sitting in plain sight. Because while Detroit had tried to drown him in noise, Whitmore would try to drown him in invisibility. And in that gilded conservatory, surrounded by chandeliers and polished wood, Darius would learn that the cruelest sound wasn't laughter. It was the sound of being deliberately unheard. Despite every warning, Darius earned the scholarship. But what awaited him inside the conservatory was a rejection darker than anything he had ever faced. The applause and laughter that had echoed in the music hall earlier still rang in Darius's ears. As he left class, cello notes clinging to him like a scar he hadn't chosen. He carried his violin case with him down the hallway, but the instrument inside felt suddenly fragile. His shoulders ached, though not from the weight of practice. It was the heaviness of humiliation, of knowing that every smirk he passed was another brick added to the wall between him and his peers. He had been at Whitmore Conservatory less than a week, and already the air pressed differently against his skin. The silence from Section 2 had followed him here, but it had changed shape. It wasn't the silence of poverty, or gunfire, or weary neighbors. It was polished silence, smiling silence. Professors who called on everyone except him. Classmates who looked through him as though he were an echo, not a presence. Performances where his name never made the program, despite his scores being high enough to warrant inclusion. It wasn't what people said outright. It was what they didn't say. "Diversity admit," whispered one girl when she thought he couldn't hear. "He's here to fill a quota," muttered another. "Smart move by the board. They get to say they're inclusive." Darius carried these fragments like glass in his pocket, cutting deeper the longer he held them. He had fought so hard to escape the noise of Detroit, only to find that in Whitmore's quiet, his voice could be erased even more easily. The cello incident had been the first public blow. Dr. Calloway hadn't just mocked him, he had marked him. Everyone now understood the hierarchy more clearly. Some students belonged, and some existed only to remind the others of their superiority. But Darius wasn't blind to everything. As the days passed, he began noticing a pattern. The few other black students in the program were rarely acknowledged. Naomi Green, a gifted pianist, raised her hand during a theory lecture, only to be cut off mid-sentence. Marcus Hill, a saxophonist, nailed a difficult passage in ensemble rehearsal, but the professor praised the white student who fumbled right after him. The message was unspoken yet constant: you can be present, but you cannot be central. And then there was Darius, forced into a performance on an instrument he had never touched, made to stumble for the amusement of others. That night, he sat in his dorm room, the violin resting across his lap. He didn't play, he only stared at the strings, fingers hovering as though pressing them might shatter the last fragile piece of his pride. "Why'd you let him do that?" Marcus's voice came from the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching. Darius lifted his head slowly. "What was I supposed to do? Walk out? Argue with him in front of the whole class?" That's exactly what he wanted. Marcus stepped in, closing the door behind him. His expression carried no judgment, only the tired recognition of someone who had been through the same battles. "Yeah, that's the trap. They want you to look angry, to prove every stereotype they've already written down about you. They'll keep pushing until you snap." Darius lowered his eyes again, silent. "You played anyway," Marcus said after a moment.
But that threw them.
They laughed, sure. But for a second, they weren't laughing. They were listening. "I saw it." Darius didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice not to crack. The next day, the whispers didn't stop. Walking across the quad, Darius caught fragments. "Cello boy," "Detroit project," "Quota kid." Each phrase carved into him. He tried to push it aside, bury himself in practice. But every time he lifted his violin to his chin, the memory of Calloway's smirk pressed heavier than the instrument itself. In chamber rehearsal, when parts were being distributed, Darius raised his hand. "Excuse me, I think I sh—" Calloway cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Mr. Coleman, best to observe for now. Learn before you leap." "But that will be all," Calloway snapped, turning to another student. "Mr. Fisher, why don't you take the lead?" The sheet music never made it into Darius's hands. Instead, he sat silent again, watching others stumble through notes he knew he could play better. It wasn't just about music. It was about presence. About being told, without words, that he had no right to lead, no right to be seen, no right to shape the sound of the room. Later, as rehearsal ended, one girl laughed quietly with her friend. "Guess the scholarship kid's on mute." Darius clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to shout. But every voice inside his head warned him that raising his tone would make him exactly what they wanted: the angry, out-of-place black boy who couldn't control himself. So he stayed silent. Again. But something was shifting inside him. Silence no longer felt like protection. It felt like suffocation. One evening, unable to bear it, he took his violin to the deserted practice rooms in the basement. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the walls stained with decades of sweat and sound. He shut the door, lifted the bow, and played. He didn't play for technique or perfection. He played for release. Each note was a cry, each phrase a protest. The strings trembled beneath his fingers, as though carrying his fury and despair, rising louder, rawer, until even the walls seemed to shake with him. Unbeknownst to him, someone was listening outside the door. When the final note faded, leaving his chest heaving and his bow trembling, a voice came from the hallway. "You don't sound like someone who doesn't belong." Darius startled. The door opened slightly, revealing Elena Vasquez, a violinist from his class. She had been one of the students laughing during the cello humiliation, her smile wide as he stumbled through wrong notes. But now her face was different, serious, curious, even unsettled. "I wasn't spying," she said quickly, stepping inside. "I was just walking past, and I don't know. I couldn't move. You sounded different, not like what they say." Darius stared at her, unsure whether to trust her words. He had seen her laugh. He had felt her ridicule. Elena seemed to read his thoughts. "I know. I laughed. Everyone did. It was easy. Safer, maybe. But when you played just now, it didn't sound like someone broken. It sounded like someone fighting." For the first time since he arrived at Whitmore, someone had admitted seeing him not as a quota, not as a joke, but as a musician. Yet Darius didn't know if this was genuine, or just another test. His silence stretched long, the weight of mistrust anchoring every word he could have spoken. Elena shifted, uncomfortable. I shouldn't have come in. Forget I said anything. She turned toward the door. Something in Darius's chest pulsed. He wanted to speak, to ask why she cared. Why now, but the words refused to leave. Instead, he simply watched her walk away, the echo of her admission lingering heavier than the bow still in his hand. And later, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Darius realized that Calloway's cruelty had done more than shame him. It had planted a seed in someone else. Someone who had laughed now couldn't stop watching. Yet something in Darius's eyes that day, something unbroken, made Elena stop laughing and start watching him differently. Elena's words haunted Darius long after she left the practice room. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her voice playing over and over. You sounded like someone fighting. It wasn't praise, not really. It was observation. But in a place where silence had become his cage, the fact that someone, even someone who had mocked him, had noticed his fight, meant more than he wanted to admit. The next morning, Darius walked through Whitmore's manicured campus, with his violin slung over his shoulder, but his eyes kept flicking toward the music building where the cello rested, silent, waiting. His humiliation wasn't fading. It was calcifying into something sharper. By the end of the week, the decision was made. Late at night, when the halls emptied and the professors had gone home, Darius returned to the music hall. The grand chandeliers were dark now, the stage empty. There, in the corner where Calloway had left it leaning, stood the cello, heavy, unfamiliar, mocking him with its size and polish. He stared at it for a long moment before setting down his violin. His fingers trembled as he reached for the cello, the weight of it pulling at his arms, as though it were testing him already. He sat, positioned it clumsily between his knees, and drew in a breath. The first sound he made was awful, a screech so sharp it made him wince. But this time, there was no audience to laugh, only the echo of his own determination filling the empty hall. Night after night he returned, his hands accustomed to the precision of violin strings, fumbled against the cello's thicker chords. His bow slipped, his notes cracked, his fingertips blistered until they bled. But he did not stop. Each drop of blood felt like a protest, each aching muscle, a refusal to surrender. Calloway thought he had reduced him to a joke, but Darius knew what he was really doing, planting a challenge. And if this place demanded he prove his existence again and again, then he would, not to impress Calloway, not even to silence the laughter, but to carve out proof for himself that he could not be erased. He taught himself in fragments. He borrowed books from the library, sneaking them out under his jacket. He watched YouTube videos when the dorm Wi-Fi actually worked, studying posture, bow hold, breathing. Sometimes he whispered instructions to himself as if coaching another boy who might have quit by now. Relax your shoulders. Don't force it. Let the string breathe. Hours turned into weeks. His schedule tightened. Violin practice by day, cello practice by night. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind sharpened. One evening, while packing up his violin in class, he overheard two students whispering, "Still trying with that thing? Calloway's probably waiting for him to break." Any day now. Darius's chest burned, but he didn't flinch. Let them believe it. Let Calloway smirk and move on. He was building something they couldn't see yet. And then something strange began to happen. The awful screeches turned into strained notes. The strained notes into hesitant phrases. The hesitant phrases into something resembling music. Crude, imperfect, but alive. The cello had a voice, deeper and heavier than his violin, but its resonance matched the weight he carried. It felt truer somehow, like the instrument wasn't asking him to sound polished, but to sound real. Every mistake, every ugly note, was another crack in the silence that tried to swallow him whole. One night, as he pressed into a passage he had practiced 100 times, the bow slipped, snapping a string with a sharp twang. Darius froze, staring at the frayed wire dangling against the wood. For a moment, despair threatened to crush him. The cello wasn't his. It belonged to the conservatory. If anyone discovered the damage, they'd say he wasn't careful, wasn't respectful, wasn't worthy. But instead of breaking down, he exhaled. He gathered what little money he had and took a bus across town, the next morning to a repair shop. The shop owner, an older man with tired eyes, studied the boy's calloused fingertips and worn case. "You've been practicing hard," the man said quietly, restringing the instrument. "Trying," Darius replied, keeping his voice even. The man handed it back without charge. "Don't stop trying." The words struck deeper than they should have. In a city where so many people gave up, a stranger's belief carried weight. Back at Whitmore, Calloway continued ignoring him. The professor barely looked his way in class now, as if Darius had already vanished. And that invisibility, meant as dismissal, gave him freedom. He practiced in the shadows where no one cared to look. But shadows don't last forever. One late night, pushing through exhaustion, Darius sat in the dim-lit practice room again. His fingers were raw, his shoulders heavy, but the notes began to take shape, low, rumbling tones that carried more than sound. They carried story, his story. The cello didn't just echo, it spoke. He closed his eyes, letting the bow glide, the music filling the room like a confession. He didn't notice the footsteps in the hallway, didn't notice the door left ajar. A small group of students had been returning from a late rehearsal upstairs when they heard the sound. At first they paused out of curiosity, expecting another screech, but what reached their ears was different. Haunting, rough yet undeniable, like a voice refusing to be silenced. They exchanged looks. Surprised. "Is that Coleman?" one whispered. "No way," another murmured. "That actually sounds good." Inside the room, Darius kept playing, unaware, each note bent under the weight of his anger and resilience, rising rawer, sharper. He imagined every laugh, every whisper, every time he had been overlooked, and poured it all into the strings, until the instrument shook in his hands. The students outside didn't laugh. They didn't even move. They just listened. And when the final note faded, heavy and unfinished, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was waiting. Unseen by Darius, a hidden audience had overheard his midnight playing. By morning, whispers would spread through the conservatory, not of his failure but of something far more dangerous, his defiance. By morning, the whispers had already begun. Darius didn't know it at first. He walked through the conservatory halls with his violin case, as always, head down, moving quietly, expecting the same silence and smirks. But something had shifted. Conversations stalled when he passed. Glances lingered longer than before. Some eyes carried curiosity, others burned with irritation. He noticed it during theory class when two students behind him whispered not with mockery but with disbelief. "That was him last night?" Had to be. Nobody else plays like that at 2 in the morning. The words prickled against Darius's back. He didn't turn. He didn't want to confirm it. But his chest tightened. Part fear, part something sharper. By the next rehearsal, the whispers had spread wider. A few students eyed him differently, their laughter muted. Instead of sneering, some simply watched, waiting to see if the rumors were true. Had Coleman, the quota admit, the cello joke, actually begun to master the instrument meant to humiliate him? Not everyone admired. Some resented. "He's just practicing like crazy. Doesn't mean he's good. They only care because it's dramatic. The scholarship kid on cello. People love that underdog story. Meanwhile, the rest of us actually deserve our spots." Every hallway echoed with fragments of opinion, each one carving new fault lines between admiration and hostility. Darius didn't feed any of it. He kept his head down, slipping into practice rooms when no one was watching. But he couldn't stop the shift from unfolding. Even Elena, who had once laughed, began trailing her gaze toward him in class. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed him in a way that unsettled both of them. And Calloway noticed. The professor had built his reputation on control. He knew which students to elevate and which to humiliate, all in service of maintaining hierarchy. But now, without his permission, something had cracked open. A boy he meant to silence was gathering attention. At first, Calloway sharpened his critiques. "Coleman," he snapped one afternoon during ensemble, "your phrasing is shallow. You play like someone who memorizes without understanding." Darius stiffened. "Yes, sir." Again, from the top, Darius played. Calloway interrupted after 3 measures. Too mechanical. No depth. Again. He played again. Still lifeless. "Do you feel anything when you touch that instrument, Coleman? Or are you only imitating the motions of real musicians?" Laughter trickled in the back of the room. Darius's jaw tightened. But not everyone laughed this time. A few students shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the professor and Darius as though questioning whether this was still critique or cruelty disguised as it. Calloway pressed harder, hiding his bias beneath technical language. "Your intonation is uneven. Your bowing is sloppy." It's no surprise you cling to long notes. They're easier than articulating real phrases. Darius bowed his head. I'll work on it. You'll need more than work. Calloway muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. Some things cannot be taught. The implication was clear. That night, Darius stayed in the practice room until his fingertips split again. Every word of Calloway's critique echoed inside him, not as instruction but as poison. Still, he practiced. He reshaped the pain into determination, the way he always had. But the whispers kept multiplying. Some students admired his refusal to quit. He's relentless, one admitted. I'd have dropped it by now. Others resented him even more fiercely. He's making us look lazy. Watch. Calloway will favor him eventually just for the narrative. The conservatory was becoming divided. Not because Darius had asked for it, but because his existence challenged the fragile order Calloway had built. The tension grew visible. In the cafeteria he noticed groups falling silent when he entered. Some tables gestured for him to join. Others turned their back. Marcus caught him once, tray in hand. They're watching you, man, he said quietly. Some are rooting for you, some want you gone. Don't let either group distract you. Darius nodded, though his chest felt heavy. He never wanted attention. He only wanted a chance to play. But attention was coming, whether he wanted it or not. 2 weeks later, the conservatory prepared for its seasonal showcase, a prestigious event where donors, critics, and families crowded into the Golden Hall to hear select students perform. It was an opportunity to prove one's place. Calloway oversaw the selection process. Everyone knew it was his stage, his power to anoint or dismiss. When the roster was posted, names stretched neatly down the list. Darius scanned quickly, not expecting to see his own. He had been excluded from every performance so far. He prepared himself for disappointment. And then he saw it. Darius Coleman, cello solo. His breath caught. His name was there. A solo. For a split second, his chest swelled. Could this mean recognition? Was Calloway finally acknowledging his effort? But then reality set in. No, this wasn't opportunity. This was setup. He had never performed on cello in public. His playing was raw, unfinished. Calloway had denied him guidance, only critique laced with ridicule. And now, in front of donors and critics, the professor had given him a solo slot. Not violin, cello. It wasn't a gift. It was a trap. Marcus leaned over his shoulder, reading the list. His jaw tightened. He's setting you up, he whispered. Darius stared at the paper, his reflection faint in the glass frame. His hands trembled. Calloway wasn't giving him recognition. He was handing him the stage to fail spectacularly, to humiliate him not just in class but in front of the people who mattered most. Behind him, voices buzzed. Coleman got a solo, on cello? That's going to be a disaster. Calloway knows what he's doing. Darius forced himself to walk away, his violin case pressing into his palm. Every step echoed louder than the last, carrying him toward a future he hadn't chosen. In his office, Calloway stood watching from a distance. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he tapped his baton against his desk. The whispers in the hall were growing. Yes, but soon they would become laughter again. He would make sure of it. When the showcase roster was posted, Darius discovered his name beside a cello solo, an opportunity engineered not to uplift him, but to destroy him in front of the entire conservatory. The posting of the showcase roster changed the air in the conservatory. Students clustered around it for days, voices humming with speculation. Some shook their heads, amused. Others leaned in, smirking. Darius's name on the list was not seen as achievement. It was seen as entertainment waiting to happen. Coleman on cello, one voice muttered in the hallway. It's like throwing a kid into the deep end without a life vest. Calloway's smart, another replied. Better to let him ruin himself on stage than waste more time in class. The words clung to Darius like sweat. He wanted to believe he could rise to the occasion, that this was his moment to prove them wrong. But the deeper he stepped into rehearsal, the clearer it became. The stage had been set against him. When sheet music for the solo was distributed, his folder was missing. He raised his hand. Excuse me, Professor. I think Calloway cut him off with that sharp, dismissive tone. It was posted days ago. If you misplaced your copy, perhaps you should learn responsibility before you learn performance. I never. Silence, Calloway snapped. You waste the class's time with excuses. The other students lowered their eyes, some smirking, others avoiding his gaze entirely. Darius's chest burned. He hadn't misplaced it. He had never received it. Without sheet music, his preparation was already crippled. Still, he refused to quit. He borrowed fragments from classmates when he could, memorizing pieces of the score, reconstructing it late at night from memory and instinct. His brain felt like a puzzle constantly missing pieces. But he pushed anyway. Days later, when he arrived for rehearsal, the cello set aside for him was damaged. A hairline crack ran down its body, and one string buzzed against the fingerboard, ruining every note he touched. "Professor," Darius said carefully, "this instrument is broken." "I can't," Calloway waved a hand. "Excuses again. A true musician adapts. But the buzz. Enough." The professor's baton struck the stand. "If you cannot handle an imperfect instrument, perhaps you are not cut out for imperfection in life. Play." Darius's throat tightened. His fingers pressed against strings that betrayed him. The buzz loud, humiliating, swallowing the music. He played through it, each note scraping against his pride. The students chuckled. Calloway nodded coolly, satisfied. "See? The music reveals the truth." That night, Darius sat alone in the practice room, staring at his violin case. For the first time since arriving at Whitmore, he felt the weight of doubt heavier than the instrument itself. What if they're right, he thought. What if all I am is their quota? A symbol, not a sound. His fingers trembled as he touched the strings. His calluses burned. The bow felt heavier than ever. He dragged it across, producing sound, but it no longer felt alive. It felt like an echo of failure. The exhaustion was more than physical. It was the constant reminder that he was not wanted, not expected to succeed, not even given the tools to try. Every hour he practiced felt like a battle against a system built to erase him. And yet every time he thought about quitting, he saw his mother's, Monica, tired, standing in their small Detroit apartment, holding the letter of his scholarship with tears in her eyes. She had sacrificed everything so he could sit here. Even in this cruelty, he couldn't quit, but he was cracking. The week before the showcase, Calloway summoned him in front of the ensemble. "Mr. Coleman, demonstrate the opening passage for us." Darius's heart pounded. He lifted the cello, his fingers stiff, and began. The broken instrument betrayed him again. Notes fell flat, buzzing, lifeless. Snickers rippled across the room. Calloway shook his head, sighing. Tragic. Raw effort without refinement is still mediocrity. Perhaps Detroit schools don't demand much. The room stilled. The words hit like a slap. Darius clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. Every note after that felt poisoned. Every practice session became heavier. He pushed himself harder, staying until dawn some nights, forcing his hands past bleeding, chasing an impossible perfection. But doubt gnawed deeper. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe no matter what I play, they'll only ever hear failure. On the eve of the showcase, he returned once more to the practice room. The building was empty, silent, the golden hall above prepared for tomorrow's spectacle. Darius sat hunched, cello against his chest, bow dragging across the strings in a desperate attempt to squeeze meaning from noise. His eyes stung. His chest tightened. For the first time, the music wouldn't come. His fingers slipped. The bow clattered against the floor. He sat frozen, head bowed, body trembling, not from exhaustion this time, but from despair. He thought of walking away, of leaving the cello on its stand, and never touching it again. He thought of calling his mother and telling her he had failed. But before the thought could take root, the door creaked. Darius jolted, turning. A figure stepped inside. It wasn't Marcus. It wasn't Elena. It wasn't Calloway. It was Professor Elaine Porter, a name Darius barely knew. She taught composition, not performance. Her classes tucked away from the grand spotlight of the conservatory. A black woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes softened by something gentler beneath. She carried herself like someone who had seen storms and survived them. She closed the door quietly behind her, studying him. "I heard you," she said simply. Darius blinked. "I what?"
"You think the halls are empty this time of night?" she continued, stepping closer. "But music travels. I was leaving my office, and I heard someone trying not just to play but to endure."
Darius swallowed, words trapped in his throat. Professor Porter set her bag down. "I know what he's doing to you. Calloway. I've seen him do it before." His chest tightened. "Then why doesn't anyone stop him?" Her eyes flickered, pain hidden in the lines of her face. "Because this institution was built on silence, and silence protects the ones in power, not the ones beneath it." Darius lowered his gaze. "Then what's the point? Why keep trying if they've already decided what I am?" She moved closer, her voice steady. "Because music isn't theirs to define. It's yours. Do you think I don't know what it's like to be erased in this place? When I was your age, I was the only black woman in this program. I was invisible until I failed. And when I did, they made sure everyone remembered it. I almost stopped playing altogether. Almost let them win. She paused, eyes fixed on him. Don't give them that victory, Darius. Your sound is not theirs to control. Something flickered in his chest, fragile but real. Professor Porter leaned in slightly. You have a choice tomorrow. You can walk out there with the weight they've put on you, or you can walk out there with the sound you've carved for yourself. One will bury you. The other might just break through. Darius stared at her, the cello heavy in his hands, doubt still gnawing but now tangled with something else. Hope. Porter stepped back, picking up her bag. I'll be in the audience, she said quietly. Whether you fail or fly. And then she left, the door clicking shut behind her. Darius sat frozen in the silence she left behind, heart pounding, hands trembling. On the eve of the showcase, Professor Elaine Porter slipped into the practice room, not to mock, but to offer Darius a life-changing proposition. The chance to redefine his music on his own terms. The door's echo lingered long after Professor Porter left the practice room. Darius sat frozen, the cello pressed to his chest, her words vibrating louder than the strings ever could. Your sound is not theirs to control. He repeated it silently, letting it thread through the exhaustion, the doubt, the layers of humiliation Calloway had wrapped around him. It wasn't a promise of victory, it was permission. Permission to exist, even if the room had already decided he shouldn't. For the first time since his arrival at Whitmore, he felt seen. The next day, as dawn bled into the conservatory's tall windows, Darius walked across the quad with a different posture. His chest still bore the weight of fear, but his steps carried something new. The whispers that trailed him no longer bent his spine. They brushed against him like wind he would have to walk through anyway. By mid-afternoon, he found himself standing outside Professor Porter's office. The door was half open, revealing a small room lined with shelves that buckled under the weight of sheet music, books, and dusty compositions no one had touched in decades. She looked up from her desk, glasses perched low on her nose. Mr. Coleman, she said, as though she had been expecting him. Come in. He stepped inside, clutching his violin case. His voice was careful. You meant what you said last night? Her eyes softened, though her tone remained steady. Every word. Sit. He obeyed, sinking into a chair across from her. The silence between them wasn't hostile, wasn't dismissive. It was patient, an invitation for him to breathe. I don't understand, Darius admitted. Why me? Why even care? Everyone else just lets him do it. Porter set down her pen. Because I was you once. Maybe not exactly, but close enough. 40 years ago, I sat in those same halls, the only black woman in the program. They didn't laugh at me outright. They didn't need to. They erased me with politeness. I was never chosen for solos, never credited for compositions. When I played, they heard the notes, but not the musician. Eventually, I stopped asking for chances. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. Silence became my shield. But silence, Mr. Coleman, is just another way of letting them win. It took me years to realize that. Darius leaned forward. So what did you do? I stopped trying to sound like them, she said simply. I stopped forcing myself into their traditions, their interpretations, their mold of what music should be. I found my voice, and though it didn't make me famous, it kept me whole. Her gaze sharpened. That's what you must decide now. Do you play their game and drown? Or do you use your voice, even if they call it noise? Darius swallowed hard. But if I fail tomorrow, you'll fail on your own terms, and that matters more than succeeding on theirs. The words sank deep. He wanted to believe them, to hold them tight enough to drown out the laughter waiting for him. Porter studied him for a long moment, then rose and crossed the room. She pulled a worn folder from a shelf and placed it before him. Inside were hand-marked scores, pieces layered with annotation. These are my compositions, she explained. No one at Whitmore ever performed them. They said they were too unconventional. But I want you to have them, not to play tomorrow. You're not ready for that. But to remind you that music doesn't belong to Calloway, or to Whitmore, or to anyone who uses tradition as a weapon. It belongs to whoever has the courage to claim it. Darius flipped through the sheets, stunned. The notes didn't follow the rigid order of conservatory standards. They bent, curved, collided. They looked alive. Why give these to me, he asked quietly. Porter smiled faintly. Because you're already bending rules. Whether you realize it or not. You picked up an instrument meant to humiliate you and turned it into a voice. That's defiance. And defiance is where art lives. For the first time in weeks, Darius felt something loosen in his chest. He nodded slowly. "I'll play tomorrow," he said more to himself than to her. No matter what, her eyes shone with approval. "Good. But remember, play for yourself. Not for their applause. Not for their acceptance. Play because you refuse to disappear." The hours leading up to the showcase blurred into frantic rehearsals. Darius's fingers bled anew, but this time he practiced with Porter's words, echoing through him. Every painful note became less about perfection and more about presence. Meanwhile, in the faculty lounge, Calloway leaned casually against a table, smirking as he sipped his coffee. A younger professor asked, "You're really putting Coleman on the program?" "Of course," Calloway replied smoothly. "Every institution needs its example. What better lesson than watching hubris collapse on stage?" The younger professor frowned but said nothing. Calloway's smirk widened. By evening, the Golden Hall was prepared. Velvet curtains framed the stage. The chandeliers blazed overhead, and rows of polished seats filled with donors, faculty, and critics. The showcase was the crown jewel of the semester, where reputations were made, or dismantled. Backstage, Darius clutched his cello, heart hammering. He could hear the muffled applause as other students performed. Each one met with polite approval. His turn was coming closer. His palms sweated, his breath shallow. Elena passed by, violin in hand. She glanced at him, her face unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might say something, but she kept walking, vanishing into the crowd of performers. Alone, Darius closed his eyes. Porter's voice whispered inside him, "Your sound is not theirs to control." He repeated it, again and again, like a prayer. The stagehand called his name. Darius rose, cello heavy against his body, and walked toward the blinding lights. Each step echoed, like a drumbeat of fate. He thought of Detroit, of knights playing against sirens, of his mother's sacrifices, of Calloway's smirk. He thought of Porter handing him her abandoned scores, her quiet defiance. This was not just performance, this was survival. But what Darius didn't know, what no one had told him, was that Calloway had one more scheme waiting. Something not written on the program. Something designed to turn the night into humiliation so absolute it would drown whatever resilience he had left. Encouraged by Porter's words, Darius vowed to perform. But beyond the curtains, Calloway's last scheme lay in wait. A trap far crueler than anything Darius could anticipate. The velvet curtains parted just enough for Darius to glimpse the ocean of faces waiting in the Golden Hall. Chandeliers spilled light across rows of donors in crisp suits, critics with sharpened pens, and faculty members seated like judges on high. The air buzzed with the low murmur of privilege, the kind of hum that said reputations would be written tonight, not with applause alone but with silence, with whispers, with verdicts hidden in nods. Backstage, Darius's hands shook around the neck of the cello. His bow arm trembled despite every hour of practice, despite Professor Porter's words echoing like a lifeline in his mind. Your sound is not theirs to control. And yet, fear crept in. What if he cracked? What if Calloway had won before he even stepped foot on stage? The stagehand's voice cut through. Darius Coleman, you are up. Every eye turned toward him as he walked under the hot lights. His steps were stiff, each one echoing across the floorboards. He adjusted the cello awkwardly between his knees, hearing faint chuckles ripple from somewhere in the crowd. Calloway sat near the front, his smirk faint, but unmistakable. He had orchestrated this moment with precision. A boy forced into the spotlight, stripped of preparation, carrying an instrument not his own. The professor's baton tapped softly against his leg, as though already keeping time for Darius's downfall. Darius lowered himself onto the chair. He set the bow against the strings. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out even the murmur of the audience. And then Calloway stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice ringing smooth and commanding. "Our next performer is a student who has bravely chosen to step outside his comfort zone. A scholarship recipient, eager but still, finding his voice." The phrasing was deliberate. Not an introduction, but a dismissal dressed as kindness. The donors smiled politely. Critics poised their pens, anticipating disaster. Darius gritted his teeth. His sound was already being written for him, before he played a single note. Calloway gestured toward him. "Mr. Coleman will now attempt a solo on the cello." Attempt. The word slid across the hall like oil, tainting the floor before Darius's bow even touched the strings. He closed his eyes, his chest tightened. For a fleeting second he thought of bolting, running off stage, sparing himself the laughter that was bound to follow. But then Porter's voice threaded through the storm inside him. Play because you refuse to disappear. Darius inhaled. He dragged the bow across the lowest string. The sound that emerged was not perfect. It cracked slightly at the edges. But it carried weight. It rumbled through the floorboards. Resonant, alive. The chuckles faltered. He pressed into the next note. Then the next. His hands shook at first, but instinct took over. He leaned into the instrument, coaxing sound that was rough. Yes, but raw, stripped of polish, filled with something no technical critique could erase. The audience stilled. In the balcony, a donor lowered her opera glasses. A critic paused mid-note, pen hovering. Elena, seated with the ensemble, felt her chest tighten. Darius played not like a student ticking boxes, but like a boy who had fought for every breath of sound. Each note carried the echo of Detroit nights, the hum of sirens drowned out by strings, the ache of being silenced and the defiance of refusing to vanish. For weeks Calloway had framed him as a failure. But here, in the Golden Hall, Darius framed himself. Calloway's smirk thinned. Darius's bow raced across strings, with urgency. He stumbled once, recovered, then surged louder. The cello roared beneath his hands, not as refined elegance, but as raw truth. The sound was jagged, alive, too honest to be ignored. The audience shifted. Donors glanced at each other, unsure whether to sneer or to listen. Critics leaned forward, pens forgotten. Something was happening that Calloway had not accounted for. The spectacle he had engineered to humiliate was shifting into something else. Darius closed his eyes tighter, imagining Monica's weary hands holding that scholarship letter, imagining Porter handing him her scores, imagining every time Calloway had called him mediocre. He poured it all into the strings, transforming humiliation into resonance. The hall, built to house perfect symphonies, now vibrated with imperfection that refused to bow. A twist of sound rose, uneven yet unshakable, and a hush fell. The donors stilled, the laughter died completely. What remained was silence of a different kind. Not dismissal but attention. The boy they had expected to fail was commanding the room. Calloway's baton froze against his knee. His face tightened, jaw clenched. This wasn't the narrative he had written. The music climbed, trembling but insistent, like a voice breaking through walls. Darius's fingers ached. His bow arm screamed, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The hall wasn't just listening. They were feeling. And feeling was more dangerous to Calloway than failure had ever been. As the final note lingered, vibrating in the chandelier-lit air, the silence stretched. No one moved. No one whispered. It was not the silence of erasure. It was the silence of shock. Darius sat frozen, bow still against the string, chest heaving. He dared not look at them. He dared not break the spell. For a moment he feared the quiet meant rejection. That they were holding back laughter, waiting for the first clap of mockery. But then something shifted. A single hand clapped, sharp and clear. It was Elena, rising slowly from her seat, her eyes wide not with pity but with something else. Respect. Another clap followed. Then another. The hall erupted into applause. Not wild, not unanimous, but undeniable. Some clapped hesitantly, unsure whether to endorse what they had witnessed. Others clapped fervently, moved beyond their own prejudice. Critics scribbled furiously, eager to capture the anomaly of the night. And Calloway? His face flushed pale, his jaw locked so tight it trembled. He forced a smile but his eyes betrayed him. He had planned humiliation. What he had birthed instead was revelation. Darius finally looked up. The faces staring back were not laughing. They were watching him with something far more dangerous than ridicule. Belief. The audience sat in stunned silence before erupting into applause, their expressions shifting as Darius played with a soul they had never heard. And in the front row Calloway's smirk had vanished, replaced by something colder fear. The applause still trembled in the rafters when the curtain fell. Darius sat frozen in his chair, bow hand shaking, chest still heaving from the performance. He had done it. He had filled the Golden Hall with sound that could not be erased. But before he could even rise from his seat, Calloway was there, sweeping backstage with his usual crisp stride, his face stretched into a smile too tight to be real. Well, the professor said, voice smooth and sharp like glass, that was entertaining. Darius looked up, stunned. Entertaining? Yes, Calloway continued, his tone louder now, as if others needed to hear. The audience loves a story. A boy who fumbles with an instrument too big for him, who scrapes his way through a performance that's compelling. It makes them feel generous. He leaned in slightly, his smile evaporating. But don't confuse pity applause with achievement. The words hit harder than the laughter had. Behind them, students filed past, some clapping Darius on the shoulder, some whispering to each other. Their eyes flickered with curiosity, confusion, even admiration, and Calloway saw it. That was what infuriated him most. Not Darius's playing, but the shift in perception. You won't mistake their indulgence for talent, will you? Calloway pressed. Because make no mistake, Coleman, you still don't belong here. Darius's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Silence was safer. Yet inside, something had shifted. The applause hadn't been pity, not all of it. Some of it had been real. He had felt it vibrate through him. Undeniable. When the showcase ended, donors and critics mingled in the lobby. Words floated through the air. Raw, unexpected, different. None of it was traditional praise, but neither was it dismissal. It was disruption. And disruption had consequences. By the next morning, the whispers inside Whitmore's halls had changed. He actually did well. Not polished, but there was something in it. I've never heard the cello sound like that. Some students began watching him differently, not as a quota or a joke, but as a possibility. That possibility was dangerous. In the faculty lounge, Calloway poured himself coffee with a hand that trembled more than he would admit. Two other professors stood nearby, voices low. It was risky to give him the stage, one said. But the reaction doesn't equal talent, Calloway snapped. The boy stumbled into sympathy. Nothing more. The other professor hesitated. Still, the audience seemed moved. Moved, Calloway repeated, his tone icy, moved by the novelty of a black scholarship student, clawing at the cello. Of course, they applaud. It feeds their own sense of charity. Don't confuse narrative with skill. The professors fell silent. Calloway adjusted his tie, satisfied. He could feel the story slipping, and he knew he had to reclaim control. By the week's end, the sabotage shifted shape. No one laughed openly now. Instead, doors closed quietly in Darius's face. Opportunities evaporated before reaching him. Sheet music was distributed late. Practice slots mysteriously overlapped. Even the accompanist seemed unavailable. When his name appeared on the schedule, the institution wasn't pushing him out loudly anymore. It was erasing him quietly. Darius felt the weight of it daily. He would arrive at a rehearsal room, only to find it already full. He would sign up for lessons only to be told the roster had been mistakenly filled. And each time the explanation was wrapped in politeness, smiles, shrugs, a soft voice saying, "Oh, perhaps next time." Polite sabotage. And behind it all, Calloway watched. His critiques became subtler but sharper. Your tone still lacks maturity. Your phrasing is emotional but imprecise. Rawness can't replace discipline. To the casual ear, they sounded like feedback. To Darius, they were daggers, each one designed to remind him that his breakthrough had changed nothing. One afternoon, he returned to his dorm to find his violin case knocked from his bed onto the floor. The strings were snapped. The wood cracked. His chest tightened. This instrument had been his anchor since childhood. The one gift from his mother that had carried him through everything. He sank to his knees, cradling it. His breath came shallow, trembling. Marcus appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. Man, who? Darius shook his head, throat tight. He didn't know. Or maybe he did. That night he sat in the practice room again, the broken violin set aside, the cello between his knees. He played, not perfectly, not even cleanly, but furiously. Each note carried grief, rage, defiance. His sound was no longer about proving himself. It was about surviving himself. Unbeknownst to him, others were still listening. Among the audience that night at the showcase had been a local arts journalist, Angela Myers, a woman with a reputation for spotlighting overlooked talent, for digging beneath the gloss of institutions. She had attended expecting polished student performances. Instead, she had witnessed Darius. She had scribbled furiously in her notebook as he played, not with the detachment of a critic, but with the urgency of someone who recognized a story burning alive on stage. And now, as Calloway tightened his grip behind closed doors, Angela tightened hers on her pen. The following Monday, Whitmore's students found the headline splashed across the Detroit Chronicle's arts section. From silence to sound, Whitmore's raw voice of defiance. Beneath it, Darius's name. His story, His performance described not as failure, not even as novelty, but as revelation. Darius Coleman did not play the cello with traditional mastery. The article read. He played with something rarer, truth. In a hall built for polish, he reminded us why music exists at all. Not to conform, but to cry out. The piece spread quickly. Donors clipped it. Students shared it. Even critics who had dismissed him in person now began to murmur his name in cautious acknowledgement. And Calloway? He read it with a hand clenched so tight the paper tore. This was no longer just about a boy embarrassing himself. On stage, this was a threat to hierarchy, to control, to the carefully curated image of Whitmore. And threats had to be crushed. As Darius endured quiet sabotage, a journalist's article about his performance spread across the city, transforming his humiliation into defiance, and his name into something Calloway could no longer control. The article spread faster than Darius could have imagined. By noon, students carried folded copies of the Detroit Chronicle under their arms. Some left it open on cafeteria tables, the headline visible for anyone passing by. Even those who had dismissed him days earlier couldn't resist reading. The words cut against the narrative Calloway had spent weeks weaving. A raw defiance in every note. A sound missing from the canon. Urgent, necessary, alive. Coleman doesn't imitate tradition. He interrupts it. For the first time, Darius's name wasn't whispered with mockery. It was spoken with curiosity. Walking across campus, he could feel the difference. Some nodded at him in passing. Others whispered with a tone that lacked its usual bite. It wasn't admiration exactly. Not yet. But it was something he had never experienced at Whitmore. Recognition. When Marcus caught up to him outside the library, he grinned. Look at you, man. Page 1. You know how many of us dreamed about even getting a mention in that paper? Darius shook his head, still dazed. I didn't ask for this. No, Marcus said, clapping his shoulder. That's what makes it real. But not everyone was smiling. Across the quad, Elena stood with two classmates, clutching her violin case. She stared at Darius, her expression unreadable. Admiration? Jealousy? Guilt? Whatever it was, she said nothing. And Calloway? He didn't even try to hide his disdain anymore. During ensemble, his critiques sharpened to knives. Coleman, you mistake rawness for artistry. Emotion without discipline is indulgence. You're confusing sympathy for skill. But each barb seemed thinner, weaker, as though even Calloway could sense his authority slipping. That night, back in his dorm, Darius unfolded the article again. He read the words slowly, as though they weren't about him at all but about someone he barely recognized. Revolutionary, necessary, missing. For so long his blackness had felt like a barrier in these halls, a shadow he dragged behind him, proof to others that he didn't belong. But here on newsprint, his difference wasn't weakness. It was power. He thought of the sounds of Detroit that had shaped him. The rumble of buses outside his window, the clatter of conversations on cracked sidewalks, the rhythm of his neighbors blasting old soul records through thin apartment walls. He had spent years trying to smooth those influences away, to sound like Whitmore wanted him to sound. But when he played at the showcase, what had broken through wasn't polish. It was them. It was him. The cello hadn't betrayed him. It had freed him. For the first time, he didn't just see himself as a violinist, or even a cellist. He saw himself as something neither world had accounted for. Both and neither, a voice forged at the collision of two worlds. He picked up the cello, sitting cross-legged on the dorm floor. He didn't play Bach or Brahms. Instead, he let his fingers move with instinct, bowing rhythms that pulsed like the city streets, then weaving them into melodies he had practiced for years. Classical precision bent into soulful grit, the two speaking to each other instead of fighting. The sound was unlike anything he had ever played. Raw, jagged, unrefined, but whole. For the first time, Darius realized he didn't need to choose between worlds. He was the bridge. The following days brought a flood of reactions. A jazz ensemble leader from Detroit emailed, asking if Darius would sit in on a set. A chamber group in Chicago invited him to audition. A local cultural center requested he perform at a community event. And then came the letter from New York. An invitation to perform at a youth showcase sponsored by the Harlem Arts Collective, a space known for launching unheard voices into national spotlight. Darius stared at the letter in disbelief. You see what's happening? Marcus said, holding the paper up. They're hearing you, man. For the first time, they're really hearing you. But with recognition came something darker. Whispers spread among faculty. Some said his rise was manufactured, that the journalist's article had given him attention he hadn't earned. Others murmured that he was too distracting from serious students. The word novelty appeared again, muttered in corners like poison. One evening, as he walked back to his dorm, he overheard two professors speaking near the fountain. He's turning the program into a circus. Better to let the attention pass. He'll fade once the novelty wears off. The words stung, but deeper still was the realization. They weren't planning to nurture him. They were planning to outlast him. And still, the invitations kept coming. Some arrived by email, others slipped under his dorm door. An anonymous note appeared once, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Keep playing like that, and you'll embarrass the whole institution." Darius stared at the note for a long time, his pulse tight. Was it a warning or a threat? Professor Porter found him later that week in the practice hall, clutching the cello with eyes heavy from sleepless nights. "They're coming for me," he admitted quietly. She studied him, her expression grave but steady. "Of course they are. You've disrupted their order. You've made them hear what they worked so hard to silence. That's what happens when you claim your sound." Darius swallowed hard. "What if they shut me out completely?" Her voice sharpened. "Then you play louder." He looked at her, uncertain. "Louder?" "Yes," Porter said firmly. "The only thing stronger than their silence is your refusal to stop." The words rooted in him, even as fear gnawed at his edges. By the end of the week, his inbox was full, invitations stacked higher. His phone buzzed with messages from strangers who had read the article. Some wrote in support, others in hostility. One email simply read, "You don't belong here. Don't mistake applause for acceptance." The line was familiar. It sounded almost like Calloway's voice. Darius shut the laptop, heart pounding. He had never asked for any of this. He had only wanted to play. But now, the weight of both admiration and resentment pressed down on him harder than ever. And he realized something terrifying. Success didn't make him safe. It made him a target. Invitations poured in, each one opening a door Darius never thought possible. But woven between them were threats, reminders that not everyone wanted his sound to be heard. The invitations that had once thrilled Darius soon became a dividing line. Every new email, every folded letter slipped under his door, widened the distance between him and the rest of the conservatory. At first, students muttered behind his back, "He's only getting attention because of that article." Journalists love a sob story. Raw doesn't mean good. They just like him because he looks different on stage. But as weeks passed and opportunities piled up, the whispers sharpened into something more dangerous. "He's stealing the spotlight. Calloway should have given those chances to someone serious. Why him and not us?" It wasn't only students. Faculty who had once ignored Darius now treated him with veiled hostility. His requests for rehearsal space were overlooked. A professor suggested his recent attention might distract from Whitmore's standards. Even administrative staff began speaking to him with clipped politeness, as though recognition had turned him into an intruder instead of a student. For the first time, Darius understood that visibility carried a price. The silence he had fought against had transformed into something sharper: envy, suspicion, resentment. And then came the betrayals. It started small. A practice schedule posted in the hallway was mysteriously altered. Darius's name crossed out, another's written in. A note slipped into his locker read, "They'll forget you in a month." But soon the attacks became personal. Rumors spread quietly that his scholarship wasn't merit-based, but pity-based, that his mother had begged the board for consideration, that his father, absent for most of Darius's life, was a criminal. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than repetition. He overheard it one afternoon in the cafeteria. "Coleman's dad did time, didn't he? Makes sense. Music's probably his only way out. Explains why they're parading him around like some redemption story." Darius froze mid-step, tray trembling in his hands. His father had left when he was 4. He didn't know where he was now. Didn't even care. But hearing strangers speak his family's name, with such certainty, sliced through him. Marcus found him later, fists clenched. "They're scared, man. That's all this is." "It feels like more than fear," Darius muttered. "It feels like hate." The words sat heavy between them. Still, Marcus wasn't always at his side. Darius had another friend too, or at least he thought he did. Elena. She had been silent since the showcase, her eyes often lingering on him in class. Sometimes she seemed to want to speak, but hesitation always won. Finally, one evening after rehearsal, she approached, You sounded incredible that night, she said quietly. Different from anyone else. Darius studied her carefully. Different how? She hesitated. Like you weren't trying to copy anyone. Like you were telling a story only you could tell. For a moment warmth flickered in his chest. She had laughed at him once. But maybe she had changed. Maybe she saw him now. But trust was fragile. Weeks later, rumors spread faster than ever. Whispers about his unstable background. About how Whitmore had lowered standards for him. He didn't know where the rumors started, but their persistence felt deliberate. Then Marcus pulled him aside one night, his face tight. I heard something. People are saying Elena's the one feeding details about you. About your mom. About your past. Darius froze. No. She wouldn't. Marcus shrugged. Think about it. Who else knew? Who else was close enough to listen? The thought cut deeper than the rumors themselves. If true, it wasn't just betrayal. It was personal. When he confronted her days later in the courtyard, she flinched at his expression. Is it true? Darius asked, his voice low. Her lips parted, then closed again. She didn't answer fast enough. Elena. His throat tightened. Finally, she whispered. I didn't mean for it to spread like that. The words knocked the air from him. She didn't deny it. You knew how much this mattered, he said, his voice cracking. You knew what it cost me to even be here. Her eyes shone with guilt, but her silence was worse than confession. He walked away, his chest hollow, his trust splintered. From then on, the betrayal haunted every note he played. But the worst came just before his biggest performance yet. The Harlem Arts Collective Showcase. An opportunity beyond Whitmore, a stage that could change his trajectory forever. He poured everything into preparation. Night after night, he practiced until his shoulders burned, until his fingertips blistered. He pushed through exhaustion, imagining the lights of Harlem, the audience that might finally hear him for who he was. The night before he was set to travel, he sat in the practice hall, bow poised, ready to run through the piece one final time. He drew the bow across the strings. Snap, the sound was sharp, violent. His eyes widened as the A string whipped against his hand, splitting skin. He gasped, dropping the bow. Before he could recover, another string gave way with a vicious crack. Then another. Within seconds, all 4 strings dangled loose, frayed, useless. Darius's breath caught. He reached for them, his chest tightening. This wasn't an accident. The cuts were too clean, the timing too precise. His cello had been sabotaged. His greatest weapon, his new voice, lay ruined in his lap. And he had less than 48 hours before Harlem. Just days before his biggest performance, Darius's cello strings snapped in his hands, sabotaged beyond repair. The silence after the strings snapped was deafening. Darius sat frozen, the broken cello in his lap, the frayed ends dangling like veins cut open. His pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't wear and tear. The clean slashes told the truth. Someone had wanted this. Someone had wanted him silent. He pressed trembling fingers against the wood, willing it to hold together, but the instrument sagged under his touch. His bow slipped to the floor. His breath grew shallow. In less than 2 days he was supposed to perform at Harlem. And now nothing. Marcus found him hours later, hunched in the corner of the practice room, staring at the wreck. What happened? Marcus whispered. Darius looked up, his voice low. Somebody cut them. All of them. Marcus's jaw tightened. You know who? He did. He didn't need to say it. The timing, the precision. This was Calloway's final strike. Or at least someone emboldened by him. Darius shook his head, eyes wet. I can't go to Harlem without an instrument. They'll laugh. I'll vanish again. Marcus crouched. Then you find another one. Easier said than done. The next morning, Darius dragged himself across campus to the instrument office. He explained everything. Strings snapped. Performance in 48 hours. Urgent need. The administrator, a thin man with a polite smile, listened carefully before shaking his head. I'm sorry. All loaners are accounted for. Please, Darius said, desperation cracking through his voice. I'll return it right after. I'll sign whatever. The policy is strict. No exceptions. Politeness had never felt so cruel. He tried classmates next. He approached Elena, his voice hesitant but steady. Can I borrow your spare? Just for Harlem. She hesitated. I don't think I can. I need it for my rehearsals. And besides, what if something happens to it? Her words struck harder than she knew. Something already had happened to his. By evening he had knocked on every door he could. Professors avoided him with thin smiles. Classmates offered excuses. Every option crumbled. Time was slipping through his fingers. That night he called home. His mother answered, her voice weary from another double shift. "Baby, you sound tired."
Darius's throat tightened. They broke it, Mom.
My cello. Cut the strings right off. I don't know what to do.
There was a pause. Then her voice, soft but unyielding. "You've played broken all your life, Darius. You think this is new?" He closed his eyes. "You think those nights with sirens outside weren't broken?" She continued. "You think carrying that violin past boys who laughed wasn't broken? Baby, you've been making music out of cracks since the day I put that scratched-up violin in your hands. Play it anyway. Make them hear it anyway." Tears blurred his vision. He whispered, "But Harlem, this isn't just practice. This is everything." "Then give them everything," she said firmly. "Not the polished part. The truth. That's what you've always had." The words anchored him. For the first time since the sabotage, his lungs filled. He thought of Porter's advice, of Marcus's loyalty, of his mother's faith. They hadn't carried him this far for him to fold now. The next day was chaos. He skipped classes, racing across the city. He visited pawnshops, second-hand stores, even a church basement where an old cello leaned forgotten against a wall. Each one failed him, too cracked, too warped, too expensive. Hours bled away. By evening he stood on the Harlem Arts Collective stage for sound check, with nothing. Other performers tuned their instruments, the air buzzing with anticipation. Darius's hands felt empty. The director approached, frowning. "Mr. Coleman, you're scheduled for rehearsal." His voice cracked. "I don't have one." The director blinked. "No instrument?" Darius's stomach dropped. This was it. The silence would win after all. But then an unexpected voice behind him. "Take mine." Darius turned. Professor Porter stood in the aisle, holding a battered violin case. He frowned. "Professor, I can't." "You can," she interrupted. "It's not a cello, but it's yours tonight, if you want it." He stared at the case. His first love, the violin, the instrument Calloway had tried to strip from him. The sound of his childhood, his survival. Could he go back? Could he stand on this stage, expected to play cello, and deliver something else entirely? Porter's gaze was steady. "They expect you to fail with silence. Prove them wrong with sound." Marcus appeared beside him, eyes wide. "Do it, man. They'll never see it coming." Darius gripped the case, his hands trembling. Inside was possibility. Inside was defiance. Hours later, as the curtain rose and the lights burned down, the audience waited for the scholarship student, who had been written off, then whispered about, then praised in headlines. They expected him to sit with a cello. They expected spectacle, or collapse. Instead, Darius stepped onto stage with the violin tucked beneath his chin. The murmurs rippled instantly. Confusion. Surprise. Disbelief. But Darius didn't flinch. He raised the bow, closed his eyes, and let silence hang for one final second. As the curtain rose in Harlem, Darius stepped onto stage with an instrument no one expected, the violin, and the entire room braced for what came next. The murmurs in the Harlem Arts Collective swelled the instant the audience saw the violin cradled under Darius's chin. This wasn't what they had been told to expect. The program read cello solo, Darius Coleman. Yet here he was, bow poised, the smaller instrument, pressed close like an extension of his breath. Confusion rippled in the crowd, growing into a low buzz of speculation. On the front row, Calloway sat rigid, his face a mask of polite surprise stretched too tight. His jaw ticked, and his fingers tapped an uneven rhythm against his thigh. He had engineered the cello humiliation to mark Darius's limits. Seeing him with a violin, a return to the instrument of his choice, his voice was an act of rebellion. Darius could feel every eye piercing through him. The weight was suffocating, but the silence was worse. He drew in a breath. His bow touched the string. The first note rang out, trembling but full. A sound sharp enough to slice through doubt, heavy enough to anchor him against the storm. It wasn't the clean polish Whitmore demanded, nor the predictable recital piece audiences anticipated. It was something else entirely, unrefined, defiant, alive. He played as if he had nothing left to lose. The melody bent with the grit of Detroit, rhythms pulsing with the echoes of traffic, footsteps, voices that had shaped him. Then it curved into classical precision, each phrase weaving into the next. Two worlds collided and fused inside the hall, Bach and basement, Whitmore and street corner, tradition and defiance. Gasps rippled through the rows. Some leaned forward, captivated. Others frowned, lips pursed, as though deciding whether to call this brilliance or blasphemy. Calloway's hand shot up. Enough. The word cracked across the hall like a whip. Darius froze, bow suspended. But the audience did not clap, did not move. They waited. Calloway rose, his voice steady but sharp. Mr. Coleman has clearly misunderstood the program. This, he gestured at the violin, disdain curling his lip, is not what was arranged. Whispers swirled, voices colliding in the golden light. Some nodded in agreement, others bristled. Darius's chest burned. But Porter's words pulsed inside him. Your sound is not theirs to control. Slowly he lowered his gaze, not to Calloway but to his instrument. He lifted the bow again. Calloway's voice grew louder. Mr. Coleman, that will be all. But Darius played. The notes cut across Calloway's command, rougher now, rawer. The melody refused to vanish. Each phrase rose louder, as if fueled by the attempt to silence it. The audience shifted. Some donors crossed their arms, offended. Others sat motionless, eyes glistening. One critic scribbled furiously, jaw slack. On stage, Darius poured himself out, his arms aching, his fingers blistering, his lungs burning. He wasn't playing for approval. He was playing against erasure. Every bowstroke was a strike against the years of whispers. Every vibration a rebellion against the smirks. Every crescendo a cry, you will hear me. Elena, seated in the ensemble off to the side, felt her chest clench. The guilt of her betrayal collided with awe. She realized in that moment what he had been fighting for all along. Not pity, not charity, but space. Calloway stormed closer to the stage, hissing to the director. Cut his mic, stop this nonsense. But the director hesitated. The room was too alive, too electrified. Cutting him off now risked more scandal than letting him play. So Darius played on. The sound swelled into something uncontainable. The violin sang with a voice larger than the boy holding it, shaking dust from the rafters. It wasn't flawless. It cracked. It broke. It bled. But it demanded to be heard. And the hall, built to showcase refinement, was trembling with truth. Instead, by the final passage, the audience had split entirely. Some sat stiff, lips pursed, arms locked across their chests, refusing to validate him. Others leaned forward with tears streaking their cheeks, their hands clutching the edges of their seats. Darius's final note stretched long, trembling, hanging in the air like a thread holding the entire room hostage. His bow shook, his chest heaved, his body ached. Then, silence. Not the silence of dismissal, nor the silence of mockery. A silence thick with choice. Darius lowered his bow slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw disbelief, anger, awe, tears. He saw Calloway's pale fury, critics' restless pens, Elena's trembling hands. For the first time he realized this moment was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone in that room. And now they had to choose. When the last note echoed into silence, the hall froze. Every person present, donor, critic, student, professor, was forced to decide in that moment, silence him, or stand for him. The final note still trembled in the Harlem Hall when the silence cracked. It began with one clap, hesitant, sharp, then another stronger. Then the sound multiplied, clashing in waves, until the hall shook with applause. Not everyone joined. Some donors sat stiff, refusing to move, lips pressed thin in disapproval. But enough stood, enough clapped furiously, enough cried openly that the moment was undeniable. For the first time in his life, Darius Coleman stood on a stage where no one could laugh him away. But as the ovation swelled, Calloway's face blanched. He stood in the aisle, his smirk gone, replaced by fury masked as poise. His eyes locked on Darius, with the same warning they always carried. This isn't over. Darius bowed once, trembling but firm. He left the stage, his body weak from the outpouring, but his spirit alight with something new. Defiance turned into recognition. Backstage, Marcus nearly crushed him in a hug. Man, you lit that place on fire. Darius gasped against his shoulder. I thought they'd boo me off. They tried, Marcus grinned, but you gave them no choice. Professor Porter arrived moments later, her eyes wet with pride. That, she whispered, was survival turned into art. Darius wanted to believe it, to savor the victory. But deep down he knew. Calloway wouldn't let it rest. The fallout began the next morning. The New York Herald ran a review headlined, "Defiance on Strings. Harlem showcased the voice classical music tried to erase." Critics dissected Darius's performance as unrefined but essential, describing it as an earthquake in a room built for whispers. Social media carried clips of his violin howling against the silence. Viewers debated furiously. Some called it brilliance. Others mocked it as undisciplined. But the arguments only amplified his name. Whitmore Conservatory couldn't contain the ripple. Donors who had once smiled politely at Calloway began asking questions. Why had a student described as mediocre shaken Harlem to its core? Why had the professor nearly cut off a performance that critics were now calling historic? Students whispered louder than ever. Elena finally found the courage to speak publicly, posting on a student forum, "I was in the room." Calloway tried to silence him. "What you saw wasn't luck. It was survival." Other students added their stories. Years of bias, favoritism, humiliation, dressed as critique. Calloway's name spread, not as an authority, but as an oppressor. The conservatory board convened emergency meetings. Donors threatened to withdraw if issues of faculty misconduct weren't addressed. For the first time, Calloway's control faltered. Meanwhile, invitations poured in faster than Darius could read them. The Detroit Symphony reached out, requesting he appear in a youth spotlight concert. A renowned jazz festival asked him to collaborate on a crossover performance. And then the call that left him speechless. The Chicago Summer Music Festival, one of the most prestigious in the country, wanted him to headline a program titled "New Voices, New Vision." Darius stared at the email, his hands trembling. Headline. Not background. Not token. Headline. Marcus whooped when he heard. "You see this? This is it, man. They can't erase you now." But Darius wasn't so sure. Recognition came. Yes, but it came with weight. Each performance now carried not just his sound, but the expectation that he represents something larger. Every time he picked up the bow, it felt heavier. When he told Porter about the Chicago invitation, she only nodded knowingly. "This is what happens when you break their silence," she said. "They will ask you to sing louder. But remember, don't let them use you. Don't let them shape you into their symbol. Stay yours." He nodded. Though the pressure gnawed, back at Whitmore, Calloway unraveled. He stormed into faculty meetings, railing against the circus surrounding Coleman. "This is not art, it's sensationalism." He spat. "He is a distraction, not a prodigy." But his words rang hollow against the headlines stacking outside. Donors referenced reviews. Students cited testimonies. The board investigated his past actions, unearthing years of complaints long buried. One afternoon, posters appeared on campus walls. "Remove Calloway. End the silence." Students had organized, using Darius's story as catalyst. What had begun as whispers now thundered through rallies. Calloway paced his office, blinds drawn, reputation crumbling. His empire of silence had fractured. The night of the Chicago Festival arrived. The theater glowed, packed with critics, musicians, and audiences hungry for the boy who had unsettled Harlem. Darius stood backstage, violin in hand, his heart pounding. The lights leaked through the curtain. He thought of Detroit, of nights spent practicing against chaos, of Calloway's smirk, of Elena's betrayal, of Porter's faith. He thought of his mother's tired hands holding that first violin. This wasn't just a performance. It was proof that he had survived every attempt to erase him. When he stepped on stage, the applause came instantly, loud, eager, expectant. He lifted his bow, and once again let the sound of two worlds collide. Classical met street rhythm. Precision bent into soul. Defiance carved into melody. The hall roared with sound, alive with a voice that could not be denied. And this time, when the last note faded, there was no hesitation. The audience rose as one, thunder shaking the rafters. Darius bowed, but his chest was heavy. The ovation rang loud, but inside he realized something deeper. This fight was never just about him. It was about every student silenced by Calloway. Every black musician told their sound was too raw, too different, too unwelcome. Every voice erased in halls built for tradition. His victory was theirs. His fight was far from over. As the lights of Chicago faded, Darius stood in the glow of applause. But deep down, he understood. This was bigger than him. And the question now was whether he could carry the weight of all those silenced voices. The winter sun spilled through Whitmore's towering windows, flooding the music hall in gold. The chandeliers, polished for the semester's first recital, shimmered with quiet authority. It was the same hall where humiliation had once carved Darius open, where laughter had turned his dream into a cruel spectacle. But today he did not sit in the back row. Today he walked onto the stage, not as a student called out for mockery, but as a guest artist invited to lead a masterclass. His name was printed boldly in the program: Darius Coleman, guest lecturer, finding your sound. The room buzzed. Rows of students, some new, some familiar, sat with notebooks open, eyes locked on him. A few in the front row shifted uncomfortably, their memories tugging at them. They remembered the boy who had once been forced to hold a cello like a joke. Now he stood above them, the spotlight his by invitation, not ridicule. Darius adjusted his